within your own organization. I'm joined by three fabulous speakers, all of whom have loads of experience in this area. So I'd like to introduce to you first Tom Hughes, Head of Risk and Financial Crime at Simply Health. Hi, Tom.
Hiya. See.
Hi. Claire Hopper, Sales Engineer at Riskonnect. Hi, Claire.
Sarah. Hi,
and Alex Sidorenko, Group Head of Risk, Insurance and Internal Audit at Sierra Verde. First,
everyone.
Hey, so perhaps if first you can explain a little bit about who you are and what your role is. Alex, could you kick us off?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's pretty much in the name. I look after the risk management function, the integration of quantitative risk analysis into decision making, the application of risk analysis in insurance, and then linking that to the internal audit plan for a group of companies which focuses on mining rare earth, and our main asset is in Brazil.
Lovely, thank you. Claire, perhaps you could just give a quick introduction to yourself as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. So my role at Riskonnect is as a sales engineer, but previously I was a trainer for quite a few years, and that included training clients on embedding their framework into using a system with us. But actually I used to also train our internal new starters on GRC and the terminology there, which I think applies a little bit to this risk culture today. So looking forward to sharing some of that with you guys.
Lovely, thank you. And Tom, you next, if you can just talk a little bit about your role.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, thank you. So Tom Hughes, Head of Risk and Financial Crime at Simply Health. Prior to that, various insurance companies within second line functions, and really I'm responsible for all things enterprise risk and financial crime, but primarily fraud.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come straight back to you, Tom. Can you start by perhaps giving us an example of where positive risk culture within an organization you've worked for, so perhaps Simply Health, has led to better decision making?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I think I've been really lucky to work in businesses where people want to do the right thing, which is really important for risk culture. And in my current organisation, we've got a very positive risk culture in many ways. So that's really driven by being purpose-led. So with a purpose to provide affordable access to healthcare for all in the UK. And I think another thing that helps there is the way that we're set up, because we're not private equity owned, we don't have shareholders, means that where a lot of companies are really motivated towards that releasing dividends, instead we can really focus on how we make a sustainable profit that we can reinvest into health solutions for customers. But in terms of transformation of risk culture, I've also worked in environments where the risk culture is maybe not as clearly defined. And that there isn't necessarily the same level of understanding, visibility and transparency that you might look for. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It might be the people you've got in place. It might be the proportionality of the framework you're trying to introduce in that stage of maturity. It might be the trust that the business has in your risk function. So in this example, where it wasn't as mature as it could have been, we really had to go back to the basics and look at how could we reset the risk management framework? How could we transition hearts and minds so that risks are understood, that they're actively managed, and that the risk management function as a whole is trusted to play an active and collaborative role. So that was what we looked to achieve, and the outcome of achieving that is that risk really becomes a commercial enabler rather than a kind of a last-minute blocker as it can be seen to be. So you're kind of evaluating the purpose of an activity, you're evaluating its alignment to the business's strategic goals, and making it really clear that you're helping to like remove boulders that could get in the way of success.
Brilliant, thank you. Claire, you mentioned you work with a lot of organisations in this kind of area. Can you give some examples perhaps of where clients have managed to improve decision making through better risk culture and how that's worked?
Definitely. I think one very similar to what Tom mentioned, like a common thing is that terminology. Like once you have a system in place or your framework in place, you want to spread that word across people and help people use a system or just any documents that you have where you're asking them for data, so that they can share their experience with you because they have the knowledge in their areas, So I don't think a risk manager can be aware of all risks that might impact an organization. You need to use people to be able to get that data in. And I think one thing I commonly see is people trying to raise the opportunity to raise incidents. So all employees can raise incidents in an organization. And then once that data is coming through, then people can use that data to see key themes, think about emerging risks that might be coming into the organization, What cost-effective controls do we have in place? And we can compare the cost of incidents with the cost of controls that we put in place and see the differences there, and really start to share that back to everybody else to see what influence they've had on helping the organization meet their objectives. So again, just like Tom said, like sharing those business objectives and goals with everyone is really the key. It's not starting with what risks we want to look at, it's starting with that business objective.
Lovely. Alex, I know this is a keen interest of yours. You know, how can you give some examples of how you've managed to use risk culture to kind of really improve decision making throughout an organization?
That was so, in my mind, a sign of a very positive and strong culture is when a business, before making an important decision, calls you and asks you for your either methodology or quantification support to do the risk analysis for that specific decision. And one thing kind of stands out in my memory. It was a while back. It was quite vivid. We were this was back in the day, more than 10 years ago, when we stopped forever using heat maps and moved to quantitative risk analysis and building proper models. And I remember we were kind of going across the company promoting the use of quantitative risk analysis. It required a lot more effort from the team. And I remember one team kind of being passionate and motivated enough to reach out and say, you know, can you help us? We feel alarmed about one of our subsidiaries, and it was a solar generation subsidiary. And so we've run a few simulations, few stress tests on the business plan for the company. And all of our simulations showed exactly the same message, that the company was going to go bankrupt either in 5 months or 7 months. And it was a multi-billion-dollar company back in the day. And I remember writing up the little summary of our analysis and sending it to the CEO, and then reading in the news the following day how the CEO went to speak to the deputy energy minister. And then within 6 months, one of the conclusions from the risk analysis was that the legislation, the current federal legislation for solar generation tariffs, would bankrupt the company because the interest rates were going up, the foreign exchange was extremely volatile, and there was a lot of operational risk which wasn't accounted for in the legislation. So anyway, within 6 months, they ended up changing the legislation. So it was kind of, and the company is still alive. It should have, been bankrupt 10 years ago. The company is still alive, and that was an amazing kind of experience when somebody absorbed that culture and was motivated enough to try something new, try risk analysis, quantitative risk analysis, to support the decision they were making. So that really stands out in my memory until now.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come to you first on this next one. So thinking about some of the examples we've had and the example that you gave, can you talk us through some of the practical steps that your clients have taken to positively influence the culture and achieve these kind of better decision making? So what's the roadmap to getting there?
Yeah, sure. I see this across different organizations, different industries. And I think, again, starting with your framework, we see a lot of documentations that people share with us before they get a system, saying like, we've thought a lot about this framework and we want to use a system to be able to implement it. So I would, I can't speak for them, but I imagine that was definitely a good first step, is aligning the terminology. From a personal experience and teaching, new employees at Riskonnect, the terminology that we use, the acronyms that we use, I would definitely advise, thinking about having a glossary of those terms before you go speaking to people, help them understand kind of what risk means to you as well. So take those steps initially, engage the organization. And then having a system in place is obviously going to be my advice, because you can get some really consistency in your data. People might have different ways that they want to articulate an incident or a control or a risk, and they might have different data that they do genuinely need to store because it's in a different area. But actually, once it's in a system, it is still stored in places where it's easy to report on. So you can see the similarities, you can see the differences. And then the next step then is to obviously review that data, look for commonalities, think about more that risk language again, like how are people articulating risk? What teams are doing well, look for those that have really good controls in place, that they're testing, that they're assessing, and speak to them and think about how that might be used in another area of the business as well. So I do see a lot of clients starting with the mature area, often is like an IT team or something like that, because they're naturally, whether they know it or not, mitigating risk all the time. And they often have a lot of knowledge to share with people. So yeah, maybe starting in one department if you're not really sure where to go, and thinking about that.
Alex, getting everybody on board with proper quantitative risk analysis, no mean feat. So what were some of the steps that you took to do that? And what are some of the steps that risk managers can take more generally to achieve better decision-making through positive risk culture?
So my experience is twofold. One is fun, one is real. For the fun part, surprisingly, the biggest thing that we've done as the risk team, which just made huge positive impact, we created an after-hours beer drinking, pizza eating, table tennis tournament. In fact, it was so successful that heads of departments complained when I wouldn't visit and talk to them for a while. That, like, why are you avoiding us? And in fact, it was so successful that the company turned it into a corporate sport and entered a corporate Champions League for table tennis, and I think they got like third place in the city at some stage. And it just started for me as a reason to have this informal interaction with all of the heads of the departments and their teams, and just talk about risk, kind of, with the beer. That's on the fun side, but on the serious side, the thing that makes the biggest difference, made the biggest difference in my experience, is making risk analysis inevitable. And that means rewriting procurement procedures, investment procedures, budgeting procedures that basically says you cannot go ahead with the budget. You cannot present it for approval unless it has, stress tests or simulations incorporated. You have to present NPVs as P90. And anybody who knows what P90 is knows that you can't get that without doing proper risk analysis. You can't get a P90 from a heat map. And just making it so inevitable, almost to a degree where block certain decisions to be presented to the board or to the executive committee unless it has proper risk analysis. So it's fun on one side, and it's making risk management, proper quantitative risk management, inevitable, unavoidable, and kind of consistent across key business decisions.
Lovely. Tom, coming to you next, what do you think are some of the key steps that risk managers can take to achieve better decision making through positive culture?
Yeah, I mean, first I love Alex's example there, by the way, and I think that might be something we'll try and spin up in our place too, actually. But I think there's two main elements for my side too, actually. On the one hand, building fantastic relationships is so important and not to be underestimated at all. I'll probably keep coming back to this, to be honest, as well, because if you build really great relationships with the people that you work with, you can really build up that trust to the point where they want to come to you. They feel like they're in a safe environment where they can raise things with you. It's not a fear of blame or anything along those kind of lines. I do think you've got to be quite strategic in how you do it at the same time, right? So, it goes through multiple layers of the business, from the board risk appetite to how that plays through your exco and how that goes through your organisation, and you're going to play that at different layers, right? So I think one of the most powerful things that we've done is to embed. Well, first of all, to identify what your key risks are, and to Claire's point, to come up with a really clear, well-understood taxonomy that people recognise. And I think when that's going well, when people start to play that language back at you as well. So I've had times when I've been in risk, business partnering meetings, and people have been using the language that's in our risk registers and our risk reporting back to us, and that's a really good sign of success, I think. But also in things like workshops. So, for example, we have a commercial awareness course and a strategic thinking course, and at the end of those courses there's a session with either me or one of my team where we try and really bring it to life with the group in a really engaging way, right? People come into the session thinking, oh god, here we go, it's an hour and a half of risk or whatever, and it's going to be really dry. But we have a very engaging session, a very interactive session, where we talk about some real life examples of risk management. We bring the strategy of the business to life. We pull out some key elements and some key risks of there. We do some low time modelling as well. That's always fun, isn't it? Some causes and consequences and such like, and maybe bring in a bit about how might we control that. And these are normally with people who are maybe not necessarily engaging with your risk registers so often. It might be more the middle layer of the organisation that can often be forgotten, I think. And it gets them thinking a little bit outside their silo, thinking about, how other areas might impact what they do, but also how the things that they do actually do typically manage risk. And again, that goes down through the layers too. So I say enforced, maybe that's the wrong word, but we at least mandated that everyone should have a risk-based objective in their personal development plan, which sounds like a really challenging thing to do. But the moment you actually start thinking about their objectives anyway, most of them are managing a risk of some sort. So it could be quality, it could be helping to achieve a sales target. But when you start pinning that, as Claire said, to the strategic objectives of the business, like everything they're doing is managing risk. So having a really strategic approach to how you tackle each of those layers is kind of how we went about it.
Lovely, thank you. Before I come on to my next question, just a reminder that we will be taking audience questions. We're happy to do so, and you can either post them in the chat or you can post them in the Q&A section, and I will put them to our panelists in a little bit. Alex, coming to you, thinking about this kind of risk journey that you've been on in the organizations you've worked with, what are some of the challenges or barriers that you've come up against, or that risk managers may come up against when doing these sorts of things? And how did you go about overcoming them?
So when I think about the challenges, I think of two things. One is because humans are so kind of entrenched in the biases and heuristics and personal hidden motivations, and some people are just not nice. You really never know what will work. So to me, culture was always a situation with like a million drops. Imagine watering your flowers with just many random initiatives trying to figure out which one will work. So risk culture is not, it's not a training once a quarter, once a year. It's like 20 different small things that individually may mean nothing, but together they kind of influence that culture. So I literally have a plan, risk culture plan, that has many specific small, sometimes insignificant actions. That's one thing. And then the other challenge, the other humongous challenge, is that once you start adjusting decisions or objectives or performance through the lens of risk, you see that some of the things that are marketed as positive are not so positive. For example, we made a lot of volume on the product, or we made a lot of money, but we also absorbed a lot of risk. The success comes at the cost. And kind of not downgrading, but adjusting people's performance, their bonuses, their salary payments based on the risk they actually take for the shareholders is something they don't take lightly. Apparently, they feel pretty precious about being remunerated for the fair amount of risk that they take, and they also sometimes think that risk is unlimited. You can take as much as you like, which is obviously not the case. Risk capital is quite a limited capacity. So the two challenges is always kind of juggling with many balls as the risk manager, trying to find what will make a difference. And the second one, kind of swimming against the current of human nature of ignoring risk and not wanting to be accountable for the risk that they take.
Perfect. Tom, what's your view on sort of key challenges you faced or you think are likely to be faced and how they might be tackled?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the challenges is that everyone you're dealing with is different. Right? There's a lot of people coming in and out of the business as well who might have come from different risk cultures too, which might take a little bit of adapting as well when you get in. And they all have different motivations. They all have different appetites and awareness of risk as well generally. So, if I think about when we implemented our GRC solution, which incidentally is Riskonnect, right? So we quickly realised who our stakeholders are. Things like, what's their attitude towards risk? What's their history on it? How busy are they? How technologically adept are they? How likely are they to embrace the kind of change that we're looking to introduce as well? And this kind of helped us to flex our approach. So, people who are more likely to adopt the solution at speed, we could give them a little bit less focus than those who necessarily needed a little bit more sort of hand-holding, I suppose, through it. With some of those, you're really influencing them to try and build them into the kind of risk culture that you're looking to adopt through selling the benefits of it. So, one of the things is, if having that transparency and that awareness and that ability to raise risk is going to give you the mechanism to bring something to the table you might not have been able to get traction on without it, right? So we might be able to come in and be that commercial enabler, help to move that boulder that I talked about earlier, and to get that out of the way. There's going to be times when you still need to put your foot down on things, but again, it's if you're understanding those relationships, you're going to have a much better time at doing it. So it's a bit like the Agile manifesto. It's about individuals and interactions for me over sort of processes and tools.
With either your training hat on or your client hat on, what do you see as some of the kind of challenges and how you've seen people successfully tackle them?
I think when it comes to risk culture, I think the obvious answers are ones that Alex and Tom gave. It's just people and their engagement with risk. Obviously, there's going to be other challenges that come across the way, but one thing that we see quite often is, people have learned risk management from different sources and different. I'm sure later today we're going to advise like different books, different YouTube channels, things like that, and then they often do have similar messaging, but often that messaging is delivered in different ways, and I think that's absolutely fine. It's trying to use that to what matters to you as an organization, and just trying to articulate a message that everyone does feel like the whole company is on board with. That way that it doesn't come down to an individual's opinion necessarily, and it's something that can be carried across as people leave or move jobs. But it's hard for me to kind of add much more than Tom and Alex, because I think they got it right there.
Okay, I'm going to pivot to some audience questions. There have been loads. So I'm going to group 3 of them together because they're all broadly on the same topic. So one person said, how to embed risk culture in practice? Doesn't this start with tone from the top? If management does not ask about main threats to performance and what teams are doing about them as a prerequisite to approving, then it's an uphill battle for risk teams. And then a couple of other people have managed tone from the top. So I think somebody said, how better to engage top management and improve the tone of the top of the organization? And someone else said, what about buy-in from senior management? So 3 questions on tone for the top, senior manager buy-in. Who'd like to go first? Alex, I'm going to pick on you.
Do you want to, Tom?
Oh.
I'm happy.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So I mean, I don't really understand what the question is, because the risk culture is a million things done simultaneously, and engaging top management is obviously one of them. I had a joke with our CFO. We embed risk culture not with the executive, but despite the executive. It means that there will always be someone who will be aggressively against any type of risk analysis, any type of risk integration. And who cares? You just embed risk culture in all the other parts of the organization. And so turn from the top. I mean, sure. I mean, it's kind of a given. You have to start with somebody at the executive. Truth be told, you probably need just one to be successful. And what I also found is that sometimes you don't even need that. I found it's much easier to speak with director level as opposed to like vice president level. And once the directors kind of fully bought into the fact that we need to do proper risk analysis for the decisions that they want to bring to the board for the approval, and they've done all the work, the vice presidents usually don't really block it. They go along with it. So there are so many ways to slice the cat that pretty much anything you can think of will probably work if your end game is to change how decisions are made within the organization and to support the decisions with proper quantitative risk analysis. How you achieve that, it's pretty much up to you. For example, I obviously am a little bit more aggressive than your average person, and so I have to this whole notion of risk management 1, risk management 2, risk management for the regulators, risk management for us internally. I literally call it us versus them. And some executives buy into that message, others don't, and I find other things that they buy into. But you know what really helps with buy-in for risk management is saving a lot of millions of dollars. Because once you save a few millions of dollars, it's a lot easier to sell risk management. And this is what I usually focus on first. Once you saved a few million on insurance, the buy-in from the top seems to be a lot easier after that.
I was going to add to what Alex said now. Sorry, Tom, for cutting in from yourself. Yeah. Just because on that point, I was also going to say about thinking about the uncertainty of opportunities. Don't forget that risk is not just about threats to the organization. It's about opportunities too. And if you can start showing that as a money-making exercise, then again, the board will be more interested in that as well. So, and we don't see that very often. I think like everyone starts with threats, that's fine. It's reactive. It's what we need to do. But once you start identifying those causes in your bow tie model, you can start thinking about how that could have a positive influence on your organization and meeting those objectives. And, you know, someone just asked in the chat then about the positive impacts post-COVID. So, you know, there's so many businesses out there that have actually done really well from COVID, from the way that they've reacted to that uncertain event. So, yes, we could learn from that and yeah, engage the board more there.
Great, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. So, look, I mean, the only thing I'd kind of add to any of that is that, you know, think about who your allies are as well. So it's a bit of a two-way street. I mean, at the same time, so, you know, I choose to work in the organization I'm in. I chose to work in the organizations I was in before. And if I find an organization that just fundamentally will not shift its risk culture, or I can't get comfortable with it, I just won't work in it, right? It's as simple as that. But you know, if you're looking to improve it, then sometimes it's a case of seeing who your allies are. You don't necessarily always want to be the person who's kind of bringing the stuff to the table. It might be that you've got a chief technology officer who really resonates with what you're saying, and, you know, influencing them to the point that they're bringing it to the table and you're backing them up is often a good thing to do. So you're not just seen as the guy who's blocking everything. So I'd say, you know, work out who your allies are, who the people are that you can trust, how you can position some of them to support you in what you're looking to achieve.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and group together some more questions. There are a lot of questions. So there's some questions on sort of the sustainability of risk culture. And some of the questions include kind of what's the best framework to identify the elements composing a risk culture, and ask about COSO2. And then there's something about how vital is a risk plan or program to sustain risk culture, and responding to what Claire mentioned about COVID, you know, once you have those wins, how do you share them back to management? Do you put them alongside the risk register? So kind of, I guess it's once you've kicked off, like what are some of the, how do you then sustain this? And how do you make sure you're thinking about the right things? And how do you make sure that you understand what good risk culture looks like? And that's what you're aiming for. Tom, I'm going to come to you first this time.
Well, a lot in there.
Sorry.
That's all right. But how to kind of keep it alive and keep it sustainable is kind of what I'm hearing there. And through continuous revision. I mean, look, I mean, you've got ways of keeping things up to date. And the COSO question is interesting. I mean, we don't necessarily conform with any particular model or standard while we're sort of influenced by them. But I think, you know, you got to make it fit for the business that you're in. So like Alex and I work in very different organisations, and I'm sure our approaches are very different. But they're probably the right fit for both the business and the stage of maturity that those businesses are in right now. So so you want to have a sustainable model by reevaluating where you are, how effective it is, you know, are you seeing the kind of risk culture that you're looking for, the kind of awareness and preferences throughout your organization that you're hoping to see, and just continually revisiting it, and, you know, ask for feedback as well. So those key stakeholders that you engage with, the ones that are willing, the ones that are resistant, you know, don't be afraid to hear it from them, hear what's working, and make sure that it keeps being aligned to the objectives of the business, right? Because they'll change. So why shouldn't your risk management framework change with it?
Yeah, great. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use my training hat here. It's like it's never ever one and done when you're training somebody. Like, and don't forget to start from the beginning as well. When you are training people again or touching base a year later, there'll be new employees in your organization. There'll be people in there'll be different environmental impacts that will be affecting your organization at that time. So, you know, don't be afraid. Don't presume everybody does know the business objectives. Presume everyone understands what the risk terminology is. You know, start from the beginning every time. Start the first 10 minutes. You will disengage people that do know it already, and I understand that. But just explain why you're, you know, starting from the beginning every time you have those chats. I think that's really important. That you will unfortunately really have people nod and agree when they actually don't know what you're talking about otherwise. And I get that a lot in training. I would have people that when I started, I'm not shy. I ask when I don't know the meanings of things. And I used to work in an organization that supported people on having alcohol and drug testing policies and procedures in their organization. However, I did not know the definition of a control. I did not know the definition of mitigation. And yet that's what I was supporting clients to do. Terminology isn't, it is everything, but because everyone should be aligned in what it means, but it doesn't mean people don't know risk management when they don't understand the words that you're using. So start afresh, help people understand that they do understand risk management and they're probably already doing it. And really just don't forget that people might be a bit shy and letting you know that they don't understand what you're saying initially, but doesn't mean that they're not intelligent and have valuable information to share.
Yeah, great. Alex?
So first of all, somebody asked for my take on the action plan, which I posted, which I think admins just deleted. So don't delete it when I post it again, please. It's me. On sustainable. So in my experience, people the kind of the default human state is ignoring risk. It's not that some people are better at managing risk, some people are worse. It's our default human state, kind of, evolutionary built is ignoring risk. And the second predominant force is self-serving bias. So, executives, decision makers, management, they're all trying to find the kind of least resistance way of achieving their personal objectives. What this means is that you almost need to be ever present for the risk culture to be sustainable, because literally the way you walk out of the room, and I mean, I had this so many times in the board meeting, while you're there in the room, everybody's risk that, risk this, risk that. And it's kind of funny, it's seeing that evolution when nobody talks about risk when you join the company. Within 6 months, they all talk about risk, but it's always kind of the wrong kind of risk. They basically misuse the term and incorrectly apply it. And then, a year later, everybody kind of talks about risk this and risk that. But literally the way you walk out of the room, or there's a new project, or there's something at stake, or somebody bonuses at stake, they'll forget about risk culture instantaneously. And so it's this kind of ongoing exercise. And my solution was, apart from creating those million small things, it's embedding risk thinking into everything, any template, any procedure, any Excel model that they build, any requirement. There's basically, it's always risk adjusted this, risk adjusted that, P90, P10, expected losses, unexpected losses, expected shortfall. It's ever present. And I don't think it solves fundamental problem of self-serving bias or human tendency to ignore risk, but it certainly kind of acts as a constant reminder. For example, any kind of training that the business is doing, any kind of leadership training, any kind of new promotee training, there has to be a little module on risk-based decision-making. Not a risk management, like, for example, I wouldn't do a risk management training as a standalone exercise. I would just change it I would just offer it as a module in all the other training programs that HRs are running. That's why I love working with corporate universities in every company where I worked, which is basically rewrote parts of all of the existing, financial literacy, management, leadership, safety, all of these trainings. They now have like this, sprinkling of risk-based thinking in that. So in my experience, that helps to keep it sustainable.
Lovely. Okay, there's a nice group of questions on sort of low risk maturity organizations. So how you go about this if you're at a company that really isn't very far along this journey and perhaps does little or no risk management. So one person said, what are the key things to consider when implementing risk culture in an organization with a very low risk maturity, initial stages, preliminary stages? Somebody else asked something very similar. Somebody asked about heat maps and whether, sorry, Alex, and whether they work in organizations where risk culture is not yet mature, as a starting point. So, and if you're starting from scratch, what do you do? So I'm going to come, Claire, to you first on this one, I think. Thinking about those organizations, because lots of us work in organizations that are really good at this, but those organizations that do not do this, they don't do any of this, they don't have the building blocks for this. Where do you start then?
Yeah, I think I'm going to give you an answer aside from what we've been saying a lot, which is like talk to people, know your business objectives, go ask people like what they think might impact that. Definitely talking to people is key, but maybe having a system in place. A lot, like I mentioned before, some people come to us with a framework first. They've spent a lot of time on that, and now they need a system. If you are starting from scratch, there's nothing to say you can't get a system first. People have data, they have information on risks, and then you could use that to teach people as well. So bow tie as well as a model, showing people that visually really helps people think about risk a lot better, so they can think about those causes and consequences. Use it as a way to really ask questions. When I'm training people internally, I do start with bow tie, and I'll say, like, what do you think is a risk to this business objective? And we'll start with that in the middle, and I won't disagree or agree. And we'll think about the causes that might happen, to like events that might occur to cause that risk to occur, and then we'll think about the consequences. And as that happens, people start to articulate the risks so much better. And I think you move things around, that maybe the consequence is actually the risk to the organization, and you get people to think about it. And I think having those visuals as a first step is really great, and just document it. Don't lose it. Come back to people, see what they've thought about since you've had that initial conversation, and just keep going. Just as we said with that sustainability.
Low maturity, risk maturity organizations, where do they start?
Yeah, so again, I think it depends. It depends on exactly what they're asking in the question. Is it whether you've got low maturity of your risk management framework or low maturity of your risk culture? And they are two distinct things, So you might have your risk management framework, but have a poor risk culture because people don't embrace it, they're not transparent with you, all these kind of things. So if it's the risk management framework, then I agree with what Claire said. Effectively, run workshops, identify your risks, identify your controls, get a solution. I do agree with having a solution. I think that small organisations might be able to work on spreadsheets, but I think what that does is create silos and doesn't necessarily allow the kind of interdepartmental relationships that you need to be aware of and manage. Having it documented through a GRC solution as well is really nice for kind of getting clearer accountability. And you talk about tone from the top, have some really clear owners of those risks and visibility of that throughout the organisation. But in terms of risk culture as well, I mean, start with a maturity assessment. There's plenty of them out there. I think Alex might have shared one already, actually, but there's lots of people out there who can provide it, or you can find one yourself as well. But you can be looking at things like the responsiveness of people. You can be looking at the level of transparency, or the general sort of risk awareness and competence that they've got. So get out there and find a framework to assess your organisation against, score against it, and then that should really inform you of what you need to work on.
Lovely. Alex, low maturity organisations, and do heat maps work in low risk maturity organisations?
Yeah, so double controversial then. On one side, God, what was the point I was trying to make? It just escaped me for a second. Low maturity organizations. Okay, and I'm purposefully being contrarian. I think the risk culture is such a basic thing as a concept. Like in all honesty, I don't understand why in 2023 we're still discussing this, because it's as basic as it gets. Like the risk, there's no secret to risk culture. It's fundamentally a very simple sequence of parallel events that needs to happen. And sorry, number one, I personally would never do a maturity assessment of risk culture, and I wouldn't waste time on that because we already know what the answer is. Regardless of whether you're mature or immature, you already know what the answer is. That there's literally like 15 things that you can do and you should do, regardless of how mature or immature your organization is, how small or big. None of this makes any difference. The 15 actions are not going to change. The kind of the intricacies within the 15 things may change, and there will be more mathematics, less mathematics. That's not important. The fundamental things are not going to change. Change the way people make decisions, change the way people are remunerated, change the way people are educated. Like, these things are so fundamental and they're so basic that no matter what your maturity is, no matter what size your company is, no matter what country you're in, it's always going to be the same thing. And literally the checklist that I've shared, it already gives you the answer of what any organization on the planet needs to do. This is what I've been doing for the last 5 companies I worked in. And it's always the same. The maturity comes in, and some people get it quicker, some people it takes longer, it takes quicker, but that's not important. The 15 things, they don't change, they're the same. And so we already know the answer to risk culture. Like, there's no mystery around risk culture. And so answering the question, what should immature companies do? They should do exactly the same as every other company on the planet. Literally, there's 15 things, and it will just take you longer. And you shouldn't worry about that because you just do them at your own pace. And speaking of risk cultures being used at immature companies, using heat maps at immature companies. Heat maps are the same things as horoscopes. They have no scientific grounding. They have no practical usefulness. So, I mean, you can literally use whatever you want. Like, if you feel like using horoscopes for important multi-million-dollar decisions, then it's up to you. I personally wouldn't, and I try to avoid it in every possible way. Whenever I am forced to present risks on some sort of matrix, I do it expected shortfall, log normal of expected shortfall versus log normal of expected loss. Which is the only mathematically sound way of representing risks on some sort of 2-dimensional matrix, which is not particularly useful anyway. But again, keep in mind that what I've said it specifically to be more controversial than I need to be.
Tom, you look like you're going to jump in.
Yeah. If I could come in, I get what you're saying, Alex, and I think there's some good points in there. I think the maturity assessment, while I'm not a great adopter of it, I think in an organisation where you might not have as much clarity from some of your other stakeholders, the positioning of where you are within a maturity assessment model can be quite useful for framing it with some of those stakeholders. So it really depends, I think, on who you're working on, who you're working with, what their understanding is, how you're going to influence them, and it may or may not be the right thing to do for your organisation. On heat maps as well, I mean, I agree with you too. There's lots of different ways to skin a cat on this one. It's a nice visual tool. That's all. I mean, it works for some.
Good. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to take in all the questions. I think. So
there was one question. There
yeah.
was one question in the very, very beginning, and we kind of skipped over it. But I think it was a very powerful question, so maybe we'll come back to it. And
which
the question
one is it?
was,
we can definitely come to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the question was, what does kind of successful or effective or good, mature risk culture looks like for you? Like, what's the one simple indication? And
yes. So I was going to come on to measurement generally because that was my next question, and there's a lot about that. But yes, there was something about. So one person said, this may not be the greatest example, but I feel risk culture in an organization is like air. You can't see it, you can't feel it, but you need it. So how do you improve it, and how do you measure? Importantly, how do you measure the progress? And a lot of people have said, how do you that you're doing this stuff, you're doing your actions, you're influencing people, you're meeting with senior management, whatever it is that whatever specific actions you decided to take to influence your risk culture. But how can you tell if it's working? And there were a few other ones on that, but there are so many questions now, it's hard to. What is the best? Do you have any suggestions about how to measure risk awareness within an organization? Like a few things about that, basically. Claire, I feel like I haven't, it's you.
Yeah, I think it's probably a harder one for me to state because I don't necessarily always see that end result in my role at Riskonnect. I'm sure a lot of my colleagues do and they support them with that. But when I was thinking about this, I thought about what indicators could you measure for yourselves with what you've already decided would be a positive risk culture. Like we're discussing on this panel and in the chat, what risk culture is. And I think there is a clear interlink with your framework too. And have you spread that message across your organization? So once you've got an idea of what a positive risk culture will look like within your organization, hopefully based on some things that have been supported in this talk today, what indicators could show you that is working over time? So I thought of some examples, but I'm not necessarily sure whether they'll apply to all, but maybe like how many risks have you identified in your risk register that are linked to a business objective? How much time, how many on-time assessments do you have? How many incidents are being raised? Like that might be more initially with a positive risk culture, not a negative thing, because you want that data coming through and you want people to raising those. And then a number of identified emerging risks, for example, a number of issues. I mean, issues, we might have different terminologies for what an issue is, but actually people raising issues to try and be more proactive about future events is a great thing. And if you've got a compliance team member who sees a change in a regulation coming next year and they can raise that with the whole organization or the key people that will be managing that issue, what risk does that have an impact on? What controls could we put in place to mitigate that before it happens? That to me is a really good sign of not just a good framework, but a risk culture, because it means people are communicating with each other and supporting each other in their different areas. So yes, to simplify, think of some indicators that you can maybe start to measure. And some of them will come naturally, again, especially if you've got an Excel model, I guess, with like totals or back to a system. I don't want to plug it too much because it could be any system, but storing that data, you could probably get some of those indicators without having to think about them too much or enter them manually in.
Tom, what does... Yeah, you know what the question is.
I know the question. So similar. One of the things that's really visible, I think, is the sharing of information, and there's different ways that you see that information, isn't there? There's new risk being recorded on a risk register. There's some of your data points that might be around things like it could even be things like your key risk indicators around things like disciplinary grievances and what's going on out there in the kind of wider risk culture of the business. But I think for me, it's more those kind of in the moment things that really tell me that the risk culture is working. So it's someone's given me a call, or someone's given one of my teams a call because they're thinking of doing something and they want to get a steer, and they're doing it early, they're doing it at the right time, they're letting us be a commercial enabler and showing that there's trust, which then again, when you come back to those key points of a good risk culture around sort of perception and trust and awareness and all these kind of things, it means it's probably working.
Alex, how do we measure success? What does success look like, indeed?
So I love this question because this is how I measure success normally when I look at other organizations other than my own. If you open up any past board meeting materials and you look for significant multi-million-dollar decisions or any big significant decisions, any budget approvals, any long-term contracts, any investment decisions, any operational, technical decisions, and you look at the supporting documents that was present, like the memos, the presentations, the reports that supported that decision, and if you don't see proper in-depth risk analysis associated with that important decision, anything else that risk managers are doing is useless. It's basically if the organization continues to make decisions that are not supported by risk analysis, it doesn't matter how big your risk register is, it doesn't matter what you do, how many trainings that you do, basically the risk management has failed. So to me, successful risk culture is the one where organization stops making deterministic decisions, moves kind of in this stochastic world, analyzes, not just presents a single alternative for approval, kind of yes, no, go, no, go, but presents alternative risk-weighted alternatives and then discusses that and challenges that and makes decisions based on proper risk analysis, then that's what a successful risk culture looks like. Everything else is risk management one, in my opinion.
Who am I coming to next? No, you've all done. Okay. I want to come back to this risk maturity thing a little bit. I've just read a few of the comments in the chat, and one of the things that people are saying is that, I'm trying to phrase it right, you know, there are some people, like, we are all very experienced with risk culture. You have all had long careers of improving risk culture in the organizations you have worked with. Not everybody has the same level or understanding of risk culture. So I think sometimes we talk about things as if they're really obvious, but perhaps they're not to everybody. So I guess with that in mind, like, let's bring it really back to the basics. What are the 2 or 3 things? What are the key things that people should be going away, having listened to us speak, and doing to try and move the needle on risk culture in their organization? Whether that's understanding where they are in the first place, whether it's a specific action they could do, you know, bring it back to actual basics. What should people go and do next? Tom.
Yeah, okay, sure. So I know we'll actually build on Alice's last point as well, because I think it's a good one. So one of the things we're trying to really focus on at the moment is building in risk and compliance by design into everything we do as well. So it comes to that same sort of point. And I think that's a really great place to start as well, because Alex, you're right, in many ways, the sort of more general enterprise risk management, risk 101 stuff is a little retrospective in nature. So if you can target those activities that are happening right now and see, you know, what governance surrounds it right now that you can piggyback off, what's in there right now where you could make sure that you're getting some risk analysis before there's a sign-up. You know? So that's your kind of your limiter, so that things don't necessarily go awry. You don't get chaos. I'll come back to the other point around building relationships, because you've got to do that, right? It is basic, but do it. So make sure you're doing that and respect them, and have a think about if there's anyone in your business you've been avoiding because they're more challenging. And you know, it's a human tendency to do that. So you know, think about those people. And is there anything else that I would I'd recommend? I'll come back to that actually, because I think those 2 are powerful points.
Okay, Alex.
So I think you've raised a very, very important point, is that we are saying fundamentally simple things. And like, for example, when I talk about, you know, expected losses, expected shortfall, these things should be kind of the foundation of the terminology of risk managers. And yet the reality is 99% of the risk managers don't understand what I've just said. And so I think the first step is to upgrade the risk management team itself, because when even when you read the action plan that I've just shared, all of the actions in my mind are really, really simple, because I understand when I say integrate into an investment decision making, I know to me it means change assumptions to distributions, find the correlations, run the simulation, have an NPV distribution curve. To me, the kind of the sequence of steps to implement that is really, really basic, because that's like the probability management 101. This is like university level degree, but only if you ever studied probability management. If you've never studied that, to you, this is like, all of this is meaningless. And it's the same with neuroscience and behavioral economics. If you know nothing about cognitive biases and how humans make decisions under uncertainty, most of the things that we're discussing are meaningless to you. You don't appreciate the fact, for example, that you can't come in at 5 p.m. to a CFO's office and ask him about his opinion about what's the likelihood of foreign exchange risk being a significant risk, or what's the impact, to put it on a heat map. You don't understand that there's actually enough science to suggest that you have zero chance of being successful in understanding the true nature of the risk if you do that, because it's late in the evening, and these are the wrong questions to ask. And there's a lot of science around that. So I think my biggest recommendation is upgrade your skills first before you're trying to kind of go to the top management and trying to influence them into making better risk-based decision making. And the skills are three things: probability management, behavioral economics, and decision science. There are literally textbooks on each of the three things. These are the core fundamental skills for a risk professional, in my opinion, for any risk professional. And once you know what decision science tells you about integrating uncertainty or risk analysis into decision making, then everything else kind of falls into places because it just becomes really, really simple.
Claire.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to repeat the question. I'll repeat the question as I understand it.
No,
so, go ahead, Sarah.
I'll repeat the question. I guess it's bringing this really back to basics and assuming that perhaps there are people in the audience who aren't, who haven't been risk managers for ages, or who have never really done a risk culture transformation project, or are thinking about it for the first time, perhaps. What are the key things they should do? What are the one or two things that they should really look at first? What are the bring it back to basics? What are the next steps?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there is two things here. Is learning about risk management in general, not just a risk culture. And like Alex said, look into things. I can definitely recommend the Risk Doctor, David Hilson YouTube channel. There's 100 risk questions. It's a whole series. The videos are like 3 to 5 minutes long each. And when I started out, I just watched those and I just found them so useful in starting from the very beginning with terminology that most people can understand. And I shared that internally with loads of new starters as well. Like, I genuinely think that is the first starting point. If you feel like you have any lack of understanding of especially terminology, that would be the key starting point. If you're further ahead, then again, it's just a learning thing more than it is just related just to risk management. Just take the time to start from the beginning, just to kind of get your head into it again. So you might understand some key points, but starting at the very beginning. So even if that means when you're talking to different team members, if you're new to an organization, you want to kind of see what the risk culture is like there, ask to meet people that you might not have been told to meet. Meet the compliance team, meet the internal controls team, ask them what their definition of risk is and what they think they do to help achieve their business objectives, and just ask the really basic questions. I don't think you need to worry about sounding like you don't know what you're talking about in that scenario. In fact, I have to say that you do sound like you know what you're talking about, because you're trying to build up that risk knowledge across the organization and not just in one department.
Lovely. Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you all to leave me with a final thought. But it has to be a very short final thought because you've got 4 minutes between the three of you. So and I'm going to come straight back to you first. If you were to leave us with one final short thought, what would it be? Watch
the Risk Doctor 100 risk questions video.
Great. Alex, final thought.
I did 3 years ago, I did a video, I did maybe 50 videos, basically counter-arguing every video that David Hilson did in his 100 videos. So yeah, sure, watch David Hilson and then watch my videos, basically giving you the full alternative, the complete 180 on everything he says. Just to be in the context, kind of broaden your horizon.
So basically, watch loads of stuff. I'm quite excited that there's all this YouTube risk.
And I don't disagree with what Alex said either. I mean, I'm not saying that everything needs to be contradicted, but I think there are starting points. And then once you learn the basics, you can enhance on that knowledge. It's really hard sometimes to understand a concept in risk management. There's a lot of methodologies out there. So even if you do change your mind on your view on risk, once you've watched more content, that's fine. But if you need a starting place, don't be afraid to just Google some definitions to terms and start there.
Oh.
Yeah, look, I'd say that just to come to some of the points that it's actually not that straightforward for some organisations. At the same time, a lot of organisations don't need quantitative modelling or anything along those kind of natures. And if you find yourself in that situation, you maybe be comfortable with that too. So don't be intimidated to get started, and definitely don't underestimate the value of the relationships that you've got in your business.
Lovely. So I want to thank all of our panelists who've been so interesting and so expert on all of this. I also want to really thank all of our attendees who've asked a load of really interesting questions that have helped shape this conversation and I think have been good. And also, if anybody hasn't looked in the chat, I really encourage you to do so, because I've also noticed that quite a lot of our panelists have been posting about what they think good risk culture looks like and some examples of what they do in their own organizations, which is also really valuable and interesting stuff. So it's great to have a lively debate. It's great to have such engaged panelists, and I've really enjoyed the talk, and I hope everybody else has too. Thank you.
And Sarah, are you going to talk? Are you going to turn the talk and the comments into an article?
Yes, the panel will be written up in our next issue. Everybody should read it. It's going to be amazing. And we will also put it up online. So we will give, it won't be as long as this panel because that would be a book, but we will write an article that gives a flavor of the most important points discussed here, and some good, hopefully practical instructions for risk managers who are at the beginning, middle, or end of this journey. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.